All right, here's 16 things I've learned about microblading so far, 2024 edition. I'm diving deep into the things I've learned in my 7 years of microblading. I'll be sharing insights, techniques, and personal experiences that I've gathered over the years. So whether you're a seasoned professional or you're curious about getting started in microblading, you're gonna find valuable information here on aftercare, numbing practices, pigment choices, and so much more. So grab your note-taking tools and let's dive in. Number 1, I prefer wet aftercare. So I've tested both methods, dry aftercare and wet aftercare, and I prefer wet aftercare. So what is wet aftercare? This is when you instruct your client to wash or wipe their eyebrows periodically on the first day or longer. And what is dry aftercare? So this is when you instruct your client to keep the brows absolutely dry and not get them wet. So why I prefer wet aftercare is because it prevents scabbing. So rarely do any of my clients scab. Their brows just get darker for about a week, and then the brows settle into their color on day 7. So the reason why this prevents scabbing is because when you finish microblading the brows, they're gonna continue to seep a serous fluid which contains lymph. If this fluid dries, it dries into a crust that forms the scab. By wiping or washing the brows every hour on the first day and then reapplying the balm, they prevent the scab from forming. In addition, I have my clients apply a tattoo patch overnight on the first night to further prevent scabs from forming, especially if they have an evening appointment. I did test dry aftercare last year, and with the only factor changed being the aftercare and the pigments and the techniques were the same, the results, I lost about 50% of the color. So after that, I'm continuing to stick with wet aftercare. Number 2, pre-numbing with the right product does not impact results. So at some point in my career, I did microblading without numbing for the first pass, and many of you also likely follow this practice. So the reasons why we didn't pre-numb is because the numbing cream changes the texture of the skin and makes it rubbery. And if you apply the numbing before the brow mapping, it wears off. If you apply it after the brow mapping, it can smear the eyebrow map, although I actually do pre-numb on top of my map and it stays put when I remove the numbing. I'll explain that in a bit. There is a brand of numbing called Zenza, which does not change the texture of the skin. So this is what I use to pre-numb my client. I apply it over top of the brow map, which I use a dry China pencil, and my mapping string is pigmented with the dry pencil wax. I don't use pre-inked thread because I've seen these lines smear due to the wetness of the ink on the string. I also have not found that it impacts my healed results at all. I've been pre-numbing again for 2 years now, and it does not impact my healed results. Number 3, carbon black is not for microblading, and it's in a lot of organic leaning pigments. Even though carbon black is technically an inorganic, it behaves like inorganic. So I go into detail on this in another video, but here's the gist. Carbon black is the smallest, lightest molecule, and it's very permanent. It tends to travel under the skin. However, I do have yet to learn the exact scientific reason as to why. It could be due to its very small molecule size, but I haven't seen any concrete evidence explaining why this happens. So therefore, when you use a pigment with carbon black, in about 3 to 5 years, that brow is going to have healed into a solid gray, bad powder brow, which is impossible to touch up with more microblading. The only options the client would have is to either remove it and start again or cover it up with an ombre brow, but it wouldn't look as good as if the skin was virgin in most cases. So therefore, I'm back to using inorganic pigments for microblading, specifically the Monica Avani line, to focus on my clients' long-term healed results. Number 4, microblading strokes always heal ashier than shading. So this is particularly due to the fact that thin lines appear cooler than a box of the same color. It's also due to the pigment being packed into a channel in the skin. So when the pigment particles are packed closely together, the wavelength of light bouncing between them is short and it reflects a blue or a purple hue. In contrast, a powder brow has the particles of pigment more spaced apart, and they reflect more orange and red wavelengths of light back to our eyes. So think about a deep cup of coffee looking black, but if you spill some of that coffee on the counter, it appears to be a warm brown. Number 5, coarse and thick hair is not for microblading. So in the beginning, we were only told that the clients we couldn't take are oily skin clients. They didn't teach us about which hair textures work better for microblading, but in my experience, coarse and thick hair textures are so thick that the microblading strokes look too thin and too pale in comparison. So the solution is not to make thicker thicker strokes, but to recommend that that client actually have a powder or an ombre brow. In some cases, perhaps a nano brow could work. However, I'm not a nano artist yet, so I can't say that for sure. Number 6, don't go outside the natural brow shape by more than 2 millimeters in any direction, otherwise it won't blend. So this means that sometimes the best decision is to have the brows not perfectly symmetrical. This is to have the strokes blend well with the natural hair for the long run. In my experience, when I go 3 millimeters or more outside the brow shape, it might look good for a while, but when I see them for their touch-up, the new sections of microblading look so obviously different from the natural hair. So keep the shape closer to the natural hairs. If I have a client and I need to prioritize blending and sacrifice symmetry, here's what I would say to them. So here you can see that one eyebrow is so much higher than the left. If we wanted perfect symmetry, I'd have to remove half of your eyebrow, which I don't want to do. I think the best solution is to have 2 beautiful eyebrows that nearly match in shape, but one will be slightly higher than the other. Otherwise, you're really going to see a difference and you're going to see that the brows are tattooed. Does that make sense? I actually haven't had a client object to this. They all understand. Number 7, dense hair is risky with microblading. So not only is coarse hair problematic, but if you have a client even with medium hair texture, but the hair is very dense and not see-through, then there's very little we can do to reshape with microblading. You can still proceed, however, you have to stick to just 1 millimeter outside the natural brow shape in any areas that are very dense. So this means that even if somebody has a mixture of dense hair and see-through hair, in the dense hair patches, you can only go 1 millimeter outside the shape, but in the see-through areas, you can expand to 2 millimeters outside the shape. Number 8, Fitzpatrick level 6 is better suited for an ombre or powder brow. So what I've experienced firsthand is that microblading strokes are just too subtle for a portion of Black clients. I want them to have the best possible results, but when you finish with microblading, it can appear as if no changes were made at all. Lighter skinned Black clients can have microblading as long as they're the right skin type and aren't oily, but if their skin is too deep in color, they would be much happier with an ombre or a powder brow. Number 9, mature clients with a lot of hyperpigmentation should not have microblading. It's known that hyperpigmentation can cause the pigment to go 2 shades darker, but in my experience with mature clients with hyperpigmentation, many of the strokes come back black and thick. So this is partly due to the hyperpigmentation, but also due to the fact that many mature skin clients have very thin skin. The combination of these 2 elements makes achieving optimal microblading results very difficult. So I would recommend that these clients go with a machine brow. Number 10, Fee-brows patterns look beautiful at first, but terrible in the long run. So one of the things I really wanted to do was master the Fee-brows patterns. They have intricate merging strokes, and I always thought that the patterns were so beautiful. I was trained in Fee-brows in 2018, and I did their patterns for years. Now that I'm seeing the aged healed results 4 years later, the patterns have merged into a gray mess. So this is also due to the fact that I was using carbon black in my pigments. However, can you do Fee-brows patterns with an inorganic pigment? So I did try this, and what I'm seeing is that inorganic strokes are healing thicker than when I was using the Fee-brows pigments. Therefore, I've stopped doing the microfiller strokes altogether, the ones that merge, because they just heal to a solid, thicker stroke in that area, and it leaves little room for the inevitable stroke expansion that will happen. So now I perform classic patterns that are best suited for long-term aged results. I try not to merge strokes anymore, except the spine, I do a little somewhat. The clients I take are my clients for life, so I want them to have the best possible long-term outcome for them and their brows, which is why I'm now sticking to classic patterns only. 11. You don't have to do all of the filler strokes. So to blend new sections of microbladed hair, sometimes you actually need to skip the filler strokes in the denser patches of hair. So let's say you had a brow that was a combination of dense hair patches and sparser see-through hair patches. I would perform fillers where there was very little hair, but I would not perform fillers where there is dense hair. So this is because if you did all the fillers as well in the denser patches, those new sections with no hair would look too light in comparison, and the overall brow won't blend. The goal with this strategy is to create a brow with even color and the best blending. Number 12, don't over modify inorganics with orange. So if you over modify with orange, then you can wind up with salmon or orange red eyebrows in a few years. Microblading is always going to heal ashier, but it's not a good idea to try to create a warmer tone initial healed result with iron oxide pigments. The brown colors now from certain pigment lines, they're designed not to fade to that undesirable red or salmon that we were seeing when I first started in 2016. But if you over modify, then you can still end up with red, orange, or a salmon eyebrow. So what I do is I make a mixture of 10 drops of pigment in my cup. So when I modify, it's 9 drops of target brown with just 1 drop of modifier. Sometimes I do 2 drops of modifier, but only if I think the risk of the brow turning salmon is low, such as if I'm working on a deep olive skin client where there's lots of green in the skin to counteract the red and orange. Number 13, don't make the brows more than 10 millimeters tall. The average eyebrow height or thickness is 7 to 8 millimeters tall at the head. So when I first started, it was the days of Anastasia Beverly Hills dip brow with really sharp arches. The thicker, the better was the ideal brow of the time. Now, brow trends have changed. We need to perform classic, timeless shapes that are right for the client and not trend-based. In many cases, the height or the thickness of the brow is on average 7 to 8 millimeters. But on occasion, if the client does have naturally thicker eyebrows or a larger face, and they can handle a brow up to 10 millimeters or 1 centimeter thick, then I'll do it. But I only do this on occasion, as typically a 10 millimeter eyebrow is too thick and too masculine for the average person. Number 14, start a stroke exactly on both arch lines to have symmetrical arches. So when I first started, I really struggled with getting the arches to be even after microblading. I swear, I followed my brow outline, but when I sat the client up to check the symmetry, one arch would be sharper or rounder, and one would be more narrow, and one would be more wide. So I fixed this problem by always starting a stroke on the arch point so that the stroke begins on the symmetrical vertical arch line on both sides. I would sometimes start the top strokes, get almost all the way to the arch, then skip the space, put the stroke on each arch point, and then fill in the remaining space on top afterwards. After that, now when I sat my clients up, more likely than not, the arches would be even. Number 15, masking is the most important factor when getting pigment into the skin. So when I first started microblading in 2016, we learned traditional microblading techniques where you dip the blade into pigment, perform a pass, and then you perform a second or third or even fourth pass to get more color into the skin. Now, I've learned other techniques such as one-pass microblading and bare or dry microblading. In both techniques, we do not rely on implanting the pigment with the blade, but rather we put an emphasis on the pigment masking step in order to get the color to stay. So when we do the pigment mask, you need to think about stretching the strokes open. So this means that you're going to stretch horizontally at the head, diagonal at the beginning of the body, and then top and bottom throughout the rest of the body and the tail. You need to rub in firmly, and I use a doe foot applicator. I prefer a doe foot applicator to a micro wand because the surface coverage of a micro wand is so small. You then need to make sure that the pigment mask is wet throughout the entire masking portion. So how I do this is I mix a glycerin-based shading solution into my pigment mix to make the mask stay wetter longer. Without it, most pigments will dry out in just 1 or 2 minutes. I also sometimes cover with plastic wrap if I'm not diluting as much because I want to have a greater color intensity. So although it can actually be argued that the plastic is going to cause the skin to sweat and push pigment out, in my experience, I actually haven't found this to take away from the healed results at all. So if you don't cover the brows with plastic, then you have to keep checking on the mask, and if it dries out, you have to stretch and re-wet it with more pigment. The timing is also really important with the pigment mask. We actually do 2 pigment masks, and this gets a little confusing. So the first pigment mask is for 5 minutes. During this first pigment mask, the strokes are fresh and there's blood pressure pushing up and out of the strokes. But after 5 minutes, you wipe off the first mask and you apply a second pigment mask for 10 minutes. The second pigment mask penetrates deeper as the blood force pushing up and out of the stroke has now calmed down. You're going to see that the strokes are still going to be too light after the 5-minute mask. It's only after the second 10-minute mask that you can really judge the stroke saturation. Now, you may need to touch up some strokes that weren't deep enough or didn't take after the first pass. And number 16, this might be obvious, but microblading takes ongoing practice. So it's not like riding a bicycle and you can become rusty. I once went away on a 2-week vacation, and when I came back, I tested my pressure on a food scale and I was way too heavy-handed. I also once took a 1.5-year hiatus during the pandemic, and when I practiced again after not touching it for so long, my patterns and artistry really needed some work. So refreshing your skills and doing practice pads, they keep your skills sharp and your work more consistently beautiful. Thank you for joining me in this comprehensive exploration of microblading in 2024. I hope this video has shed some light on various aspects of the process, from aftercare to technique nuances, and has equipped you with the knowledge to either enhance your microblading skills or make informed decisions about undergoing the treatment or starting to learn this technique. So remember, the world of beauty and microblading is ever evolving, so staying informed is the key to achieving the best possible outcome. If you found this video to be helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. And as always, feel free to drop your questions or experiences in the comments below. So let's continue to learn and grow together in our journey towards beauty excellence. And until next time, take care and keep enhancing your microblading work one stroke at a time.